What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
You know that moment when you walk into a courthouse with your head up because you have nothing left to lose and even less to prove, and the judge barely raises his eyes, glances at you, then at the two people who taught you the exact shape of neglect, and says slowly, like he is peeling a stubborn sticker off a glass jar, "Wait, you're suing her," and the color drains from their faces so completely you could swear the room got colder, and for a beat you realize this might be the first time anyone with a gavel has seen you the way your grandfather did, as someone who learned the hard way to stand straight in a stiff wind. That was my entrance, my hook, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your spine settle at the same time. But to understand how I got to that doorway with my jaw set and my nerves humming like telephone wires in August, you need to follow me back to a Tuesday morning that started with dishwater and ended with a letter that felt like striking a match in a hayloft. I was elbow-deep in a sink full of suds, chasing dried cereal off Jack's favorite bowl, the one with the faded blue trucks he has insisted on since he was 3 and still grabs at 9, when the phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. A Columbus area code that tugged at an old muscle memory, and my cousin Mark's voice came through with that tight, careful sound people use when they're trying to land bad news without breaking it, telling me Grandpa Harlan passed in his sleep. No alarms. And no fuss, which is exactly how he went through mornings for as long as I can remember, boots on before the rooster had the good sense to clear his throat. By the time I drove my rattling pickup down the county road to the farmhouse with the peeling white paint and the front porch swing that never once complained about carrying my teenage sulks, the arrangements were already moving like a church potluck where every lady brings her best casserole, and I kept myself busy with lists so I wouldn't think about how the kitchen still smelled like pipe tobacco and rain. The will reading came fast, the way time speeds up when you least want it to, and I sat in Mr. Ellis's leather chair with my hands folded over my knees like a kid called to the principal, only this principal cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and read a line I will hear in my head until the day I cannot hear anything at all. Harlan James Harper bequeaths the farm, the feed store, the equipment, the accounts, and the residuals to his granddaughter Emily Harper, the person who has always understood the work and the why, blood or no, with the request that she keep what should be kept and let go of what needs letting go, and before I could absorb the weight of 200 acres and a payroll and a lifetime of early mornings, Mark leaned in and whispered that my parents, Richard and Linda, had already called from Florida like they were ordering room service, furious and loud and asking how fast they could freeze the assets, and the absurdity of it hit me so hard I laughed. That ugly little laugh you let out when you realize the joke has been on you for years, and you somehow missed the punchline. On the drive back, I stopped at the farmhouse mailbox out of muscle memory, pulled out a thick envelope addressed in Grandpa's shaky script, saw the postmark from 3 weeks earlier, and felt the kind of dread that makes you set your feet before you open the thing, which I did under the porch light, reading words that did not so much explain as warn am. There are truths out here that have been buried so long they think they're roots. Your parents will want what they think they're owed, but what they want and what they've earned are different animals, and if they come after you, remember that the right words at the right time can turn a stampede. Tucked behind that letter was a photocopy of a document so worn it looked like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times, and I only had time to catch a glimpse of my own name next to a blank line where a father should have been before the porch light flickered and the phone buzzed again with a voicemail from a lawyer I did not know, announcing a petition to contest the will for undue influence, which is a fancy way of saying they were calling me a manipulator while trying to pick my pockets with both hands. People like to pretend that grief makes you gentle, but what it does, if you've been training for it your whole life, is it sharpens you, trims you down to the blade you need to cut a path, and, because I have learned to fix a broken gate with baling wire and patience, I started with the small, steady things, like laying out Grandpa's best flannel for the viewing and calling the feed store crew to make sure paychecks went out on Friday, and when the preacher asked for details for the obituary, I felt something click inside me, not cruel, not petty, just precise, like slipping a key into the right lock, because if my parents wanted to introduce themselves to this story by filing papers from 1,000 miles away, Then I would introduce them to this town the way this town remembers, which is to say by telling the truth plainly enough that nobody needs to embellish, and I dictated a tribute so clean you could eat off it, a thank you to neighbors who showed up in the snow and in the drought. A line about a grandfather who raised a granddaughter after her parents moved south for opportunities that never seemed to include birthdays or school plays. A note that Harlan updated his will in the presence of witnesses who also knew his mind because he still argued seed prices better than men half his age, and I tucked in a photograph the paper already had from a harvest festival. Me on the tractor and him in the passenger seat with his cap pushed back and that ornery grin, and I made sure. The caption read, "The hands that kept the place running," which around here is as loud as a parade. The call started before noon the next day, not from my parents, of course. They prefer email when there's a paper trail to manage. But from Mrs. Delaney across the road, who said she cried over her coffee, and from Tom Riley, who said the piece made him stand up at his kitchen table and clap like a fool. While somewhere in a Florida condo with seashell wallpaper, I imagined two faces, went the color of skim milk, because the comments under the online edition filled up with names my parents still recognized from graduation programs and tax records. People saying what a shame it is when the ones who leave only come back for the reading of the will, and I will not lie, the satisfaction ran through me like good bourbon, warm and steady. Because subtle revenge tastes best when you can still pass a breathalyzer afterward. That night, after Jack fell asleep under a pile of library books and the house went quiet in that way old houses do, all settling and sighing like they are relieved you made it through another day, I spread Grandpa's letter and that photocopy on the kitchen table. Squinted until the blank space on the line next to Father seemed to throb, and told myself I would not chase ghosts until the court put a date on the calendar, but then my phone pinged with a calendar alert I did not set. An emergency hearing notice popped into my email like a wasp through a screen door, and beneath the legal language was a list of exhibits my parents planned to file, including statements about my influence that I could tell were stitched together from gossip and guesswork, and even as my pulse jumped, a different part of me, the part that has learned to wait out a summer storm without losing sight of the fence line, started planning the next move. Because if they wanted to make this a show, I could give them a matinee. Waking up with the taste of yesterday's coffee still lingering and that emergency hearing notice glaring from my inbox like an uninvited guest who won't take the hint, I decided the best way to stare down a storm was to walk right into it with boots laced and a plan sketched on the back of an envelope. So after kissing Jack goodbye at the bus stop with a promise of extra story time if he aced his spelling test, I pointed my pickup toward downtown Columbus, where Mr. Ellis's office waited with its brass plaque and the faint scent of old paper that always makes legal matters feel both smaller and larger than life, and Carla Ruiz, the associate he'd recommended, turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a handshake that said she had shaken down tougher opponents than a pair of sun-faded parents chasing an inheritance they had ignored for decades. She listened to my rundown without interrupting, her pen tapping a rhythm on the notepad as I laid out the letter, the photocopy with its glaring blank, and the voicemail that had turned my quiet grief into a full-blown sideshow. Then she leaned back and said we needed to build a wall of evidence starting with public records and witness statements, because contesting a will like Grandpa's, clear-headed, witnessed, notarized, would take more than sour grapes from Florida to topple, and by the time I left her office 2 hours later with a stack of forms and a retainer check that dipped into the farm's operating funds just enough to make me wince, I felt the first real shift from reacting to readying, like switching from passenger to driver on a road you know has potholes, but also scenic views if you time the turns right. The county archives became my afternoon haunt, a basement room stacked with filing cabinets that hummed under fluorescent lights, where I pulled marriage licenses showing Richard and Linda tying the knot in a quickie ceremony right after high school with me already on the way like an unplanned detour. And divorce filings they had started but never finished because Grandpa had stepped in with loans and lectures that kept the roof over our heads until they decided the grass was greener in condos with pools and no livestock smells, the documents painting them not as villains in a novel but as everyday opportunists who calculated costs and cut losses. including the one that looked most like me with my stubborn chin and habit of asking questions they preferred to dodge. Back at the farmhouse that evening, with Jack buried in homework and the crickets starting their nightly chorus outside the screen door, I hauled down the attic boxes Grandpa had labeled in his block letters: tools, taxes, treasures, and sifted through photo albums that captured summers the first had half forgotten, me knee-deep in creek mud with a fishing pole while my parents posed in one blurry shot at a beach bar. Their smiles wide, but their arms empty of anything that resembled parenting, and the humor of it struck me as I showed a few to Sarah over a video call, her laughing until she snorted about how they looked like extras in a bad vacation commercial. The kind where the fine print says, "Kids not included," which lightened the load just enough to keep me from crumbling under the weight of what those pictures really meant: a childhood patched together with Grandpa's calloused hands and the kindness of neighbors who filled in the gaps. But the real spark for what came next ignited when I drove over to Mrs. Delaney's the following morning, her kitchen table spread with coffee cake still warm from the oven and stories flowing as freely as the brew. Because after reading my obituary piece, she had called to say she had things to add. Things about the nights my parents argued loud enough to wake the dogs and the traveling salesman who lingered too long in our driveway with whispers and envelopes that Grandpa later burned in the barrel out back, suggesting their split wasn't just wanderlust, but a tangled mess of infidelity that Harlan had hushed up to protect the family name and the farm's reputation in a town where gossip spreads faster than blight. And as she described Richard's temper flaring over suspicions while Linda packed her bags for what was supposed to be a weekend away that stretched into years, I felt the pieces clicking with that blank line on the photocopy. A subtle clue that maybe bloodlines weren't as straight as the county roads, making my pulse quicken with the possibility that Grandpa's favoritism stemmed from a secret he carried alone to keep me from shattering under truths too heavy for a teenager already reeling from abandonment. Armed with that whisper of scandal, the revenge I plotted wasn't some dramatic showdown but a quiet, clever nudge, the kind that works because it lets the truth do the heavy lifting, so I crafted an anonymous email to the local paper's editor. Nothing libelous, just a tip about the Harper lawsuit with attached public records of the old divorce attempts and a nudge toward Mrs. Delaney as a source who remembered the family troubles that sent a young girl to live with her grandparents, phrasing it like a concerned citizen worried about legacy and loyalty in hard times, and by lunchtime the next day the story broke online with a headline about "Inheritance Feud Rocks Local Farm Legacy," complete with a tasteful photo of the homestead at dusk. The article quoting neighbors on how Emily had kept things running while absentee kin enjoyed retirement perks, and I could almost hear the fallout in Florida, Richard probably sputtering over his golf magazine while Linda refreshed the page in horror, their hypocrisy laid bare without me lifting a finger beyond hitting send, a satisfying wit in the way it turned their greed into small-town folklore without crossing into outright mudslinging that Carla might scold me for. The growing uncertainty wrapped around me like fog off the river as the hearing date approached, Carla calling with updates on how my parents' lawyer was pushing for discovery that included my financials, which made me laugh bitterly at the irony of them auditing the granddaughter they had left to fend for scraps, but the conflict deepened when Sarah stopped by after her shift at the library. Her face serious as she set down a casserole and said I should consider mediation because winning the farm might feel like triumph now, but losing the last threads of family could leave Jack wondering why his mom carried grudges like luggage. Her words poking at that disagreeable spot where my choices started to feel less like justice and more like echoing the neglect I resented. Yet, even as I nodded and promised to think on it, the phone rang with Tom Riley on the line. Grandpa's old partner inviting me to his barn for a chat about ledgers that could bolster our case, his voice hinting at more than numbers, like he knew pieces of the puzzle Mrs. Delaney had only grazed, and as I hung up and stared at the article still open on my laptop, the comments piling up with support that warmed like sunlight, but also warnings about how deep family dirt could bury you if you dug too greedily, I felt the impending revenge sharpening into something inevitable. A blade I wielded carefully because the next confrontation might force me to swing it Just as dusk settled and I was locking up the chicken coop with the day's eggs tucked in my apron, headlights swept the driveway, and a courier stepped out of a sedan with an envelope sealed with wax that screamed official. The cover letter from Richard and Linda proposing a sit-down in neutral territory, a roadside diner halfway between here and the airport, framed as a chance to avoid the spectacle and remember we're blood. Their words slick with that false warmth that had fooled me as a kid, but now rang hollow as a dry well, leaving me standing there under the stars wondering if this was a genuine olive branch or the trap of a cornered fox, and what additional secrets they might dangle to pull me into their web before the gavel fell. Sliding into that booth at the roadside diner with its vinyl seats cracked from years of truckers and travelers wiping grease on their jeans, I eyed Richard and Linda across the Formica table like they were exhibits in a museum of bad decisions. Their smiles stretched thin as they pushed a menu my way and suggested splitting a slice of pie to talk like civilized folks before the depositions turned everything into a circus, but the air between us crackled with the kind of tension that comes from pretending at peace when the knives are already sharpened, and as they launched into a rehearsed speech about how the lawsuit was really about fairness and family unity, not the money that had suddenly made them rediscover their only daughter after 26 years of radio silence. I sipped my coffee black and let Carla's advice echo in my head to listen more than I spoke, because sometimes the truth slips out when people think they're winning the room. Their pitch boiled down to me handing over half the farm's value in a quiet settlement, no courts and no scandals, with vague promises of making up for lost time that rang as false as a $3 bill. Especially when Linda reached across to pat my hand and mentioned in passing how Grandpa had always favored me unfairly, a slip that hinted they knew more about that photocopy than they'd let on, making my skin crawl because it suggested they'd been digging in ways that crossed from legal to sneaky, perhaps hiring some private eye to rummage through old files while I was busy burying the man who'd actually raised me. I kept my responses short and neutral, nodding along until the pie arrived untouched, then excused myself with a line about needing to check on Jack, leaving them with a check and a business card for Carla that said all negotiations went through her. The subtle power shift satisfying in its quiet way as I climbed into my pickup and drove back with the windows down, the highway wind whipping away the diner. Smell of burnt toast and broken trust, feeling the uncertainty coil tighter because their offer wasn't just desperate, it was calculated, like they held a card they thought would force my hand. And the growing conflict gnawed at me harder than the gravel under my tires. The depositions kicked off 2 days later in a conference room that smelled of stale donuts and printer ink. Richard and Linda sworn in first with their lawyer, a slick type named Hargrove who reminded me of a used car salesman with a law degree, leading them through a narrative of how Grandpa's mind had slipped in his later years, painting me as the opportunist who'd whispered sweet nothings about legacy to an old man desperate for company. But Carla dismantled it step by step with medical records showing Harlan sharp as a tack until the end, including a doctor's note from just months before about his debates over crop yields that could outlast a filibuster, and when it was my turn, I recounted the everyday truths of our bond, like the evenings we'd spend fixing fence posts while he grumbled about politicians who wouldn't know soil from sidewalk, my voice steady but laced with that honest edge that comes from living the story rather than scripting it. That's when Tom Riley strode in as our surprise witness, Grandpa's longtime business partner with his weathered face and calloused palms from decades shaking hands over hay bales, carrying a ledger thick as a Bible that detailed how the farm had thrived under my occasional oversight while my parents sent holiday cards that doubled as tax write-offs. His testimony booming with anecdotes about Harlan confiding that the will was his way of righting old wrongs, specifically mentioning how he'd cut Richard and Linda out not for spite, but because their choices had fractured the family long before the ink dried, and Tom's alliance felt like a lifeline thrown from solid ground, especially when he pulled me aside afterward to say he had more documents at home. Hints about why Harlan had taken such pains to protect me, his gruff chuckle lightening the mood as he joked that my parents were dumber than a screen door on a submarine if they thought a judge would buy their version over the evidence of a lifetime. Yet the dilemma struck deep that same evening when Sarah dropped by unannounced with a bottle of wine and her no-nonsense stare, insisting we talk because the whole town was buzzing about the depositions, and she worried my thirst for payback was turning me into the kind of grudge holder who'd poison her own well, pointing out how leaking that tip to the paper had already painted me as the instigator in some folks' eyes, even if it felt justified, and her words hit that disagreeable nerve where viewers might nod along to my anger but pause at the pettiness, wondering if mercy wouldn't serve Jack better than a courtroom win that left scars on everyone, making me question for the first time if my clever revenges were building a bridge or just burning one behind me. The humor in her lecture coming through when she quipped that holding on to spite was like keeping a skunk for a pet. Smells bad and nobody wants to visit, yet even as I poured us glasses and admitted she had a point, the pull toward action won out because the next morning I uncovered public financial filings from their Florida filings, statements showing they'd sunk Grandpa's old loans into failed real estate schemes that left them scraping by on Social Security and side hustles. And with Carla's green light on anything publicly available, I forwarded the docs anonymously to a few key town influencers, the feed store manager, the Chamber of Commerce president, framed as background for anyone curious about the lawsuit's roots, the leak spreading like wildfire through email chains and coffee clutches, embarrassing them with details of bounced checks and maxed credit lines that made their greed look not just entitled, but downright foolish. A witty satisfaction blooming as I imagined Richard's face reddening over his morning paper while the local blog picked it up with a headline about Sunbelt dreams meet Heartland reality, turning their financial skeletons into community cautionary tales without me uttering a single accusation in court. The twist deepened the shadows as Carla and I reviewed the deposition transcripts over lunch at the courthouse cafeteria, her pointing out a line from Linda's testimony where she vaguely alluded to irregularities in my birth records that Grandpa had hidden to manipulate loyalties, the words tying directly to that blank father line and suggesting Harlan had excluded them because the truth about my parentage, perhaps Richard not being blood or the affair bearing fruit in ways they'd buried, had driven a wedge deeper than any will could mend, a revelation that left me reeling with the possibility that my entire sense of family rested on a lie Grandpa had shouldered alone to give me roots in fertile soil. The uncertainty amplifying the impending revenge as I wrestled with whether to subpoena those records or let the ambiguity work in my favor, building conflict that made every step feel like navigating a minefield disguised as a meadow. The atmosphere thickened with that constant edge. When Tom called later that afternoon, his voice low as he mentioned overhearing Hargrove on the phone about a witness who could flip the narrative, a betrayal hinting someone from our side might crack under pressure, pushing me to fortify alliances while the Revenge's clever edge sharpened my resolve, because if they wanted to play dirty with half-truths, I'd counter with the full weight of what they'd forsaken. As the sun dipped low and I was sorting through Jack's school backpack for permission slips that always seemed to multiply like rabbits, my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. The message simple but loaded, "Meet us at the park tomorrow at noon. We've got proof that changes everything. Come alone if you want answers before the trial buries us all." The words from Richard and Linda's burner phone unmistakable in their urgency. A fake reconciliation ambush that dangled the parentage secret like bait on a hook, leaving me staring at the screen in the dim kitchen light, heart pounding with the dilemma of walking into their trap or letting the truth fester unspoken, wondering what bombshell they thought could still sway the scales. Arriving at the park bench under the sprawling oak that had shaded picnics and proposals for generations, I scanned the empty paths for Richard and Linda. My coffee cup from the drive-thru steaming in my hand as a buffer against the chill morning air that carried hints of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. And when they emerged from their rental car looking every bit the reluctant diplomats in pressed khakis and cardigans that screamed Florida tourist, I stayed standing to keep the high ground, their approach laced with that awkward shuffle of people who think familiarity breeds forgiveness after years of absence. But the ambush unfolded almost immediately as they sat and slid a folder across the weathered wood, claiming it held proof of Grandpa's manipulation tied to my birth irregularities. The documents inside a mishmash of old hospital notes and a letter from some long-gone doctor vaguely questioning paternity without naming names, their pitch that this secret explained why Harlan had stolen me away, and now I owed them for the family fractured by his meddling. A narrative so twisted it made my laugh bubble up sharp and disbelieving, because here they were, the architects of my abandonment, trying to flip the script as if their affair-born regrets entitled them to a payout, and I felt the dilemma twist in my gut like a bad knot. The urge to hurl the folder back and walk away clashing with the nagging pull to demand the full story right there amid the joggers and dog walkers who might overhear enough to fuel the next round of town talk. We talked in circles for an hour, their voices dropping to whispers about how settling quietly would spare Jack the ugly details of a possible non-blood tie, words that poked at my protective instincts even as they reeked of coercion. And by the time I left with the folder tucked under my arm, not out of agreement, but to hand over to Carla for verification, the uncertainty had rooted deeper, making me question if chasing this parentage rabbit hole would unearth justice or just more dirt that buried me alongside them, the light vulgarity of their hypocrisy hitting me on the drive home as I muttered to myself that they were sneakier than a fox in a henhouse promising vegan treats. Yet the conflict grew with every mile because withholding this from the court felt like handing them ammunition while spilling it risked turning the trial into a tabloid spectacle that disagreed with the quiet dignity Grandpa had always modeled. The pretrial hearings ramped up the pressure like a boiler building steam in an old locomotive, starting with motions in a courtroom paneled in dark walnut that echoed every footfall and cough, where Hargrove argued for freezing the estate assets pending full discovery, his slides projecting blurry timelines of my influence over Grandpa that conveniently omitted the decades they'd spent mailing checks for Christmas that never arrived. But Carla countered with affidavits from the wills. Witnesses, two retired farmers who'd shared beers with Harlan the night he signed, attesting to his clarity and conviction about leaving it all to the granddaughter who'd shown up for branding days and bail bonds when they hadn't. And as I took the stand to describe those routines, the judge, a silver-haired man named Harlan, coincidentally enough, interrupted with pointed questions that zeroed in on my parents' absence, his tone slow and deliberate as he asked why exactly they'd waited until the will was read to reinsert themselves into the picture, the glance he shot their way making Richard shift in his seat and Linda fiddle with her necklace, a subtle twist that hinted he saw through their facade earlier than expected, planting seeds of doubt that rippled through the room and left their side scrambling to redirect with character witnesses who painted them as devoted from afar, claims so thin they cracked under cross like cheap china. That early judicial skepticism fueled my resolve, but also amplified the internal wrestle, because during a recess Carla pulled me into the hallway and laid out the folder's contents, confirming the paternity hints, but advising against introducing them yet since they could backfire as hearsay without DNA proof. Her warning that weaponizing family secrets might make me look vengeful rather than victimized, striking that disagreeable chord where audience sympathy might waver, wondering if my pursuit of truth edged too close to the pettiness I'd accused them of, especially when Sarah called later that night with her usual blend of support and scolding, joking that digging up graves was fine for archaeologists, but messy for moms trying to keep bedtime stories wholesome. Her humor lightening the load just enough to let me breathe. The witty revenge I executed next stemmed from that frustration, a calculated leak that stayed within the lines of public interest without dipping into outright sabotage, because after scanning the folder's innocuous parts, like the doctor's old letter that was more question than fact, I anonymized a social media post from a throwaway account tied to no one, sharing a timeline of the Harper family farm's history with public photos of me and Grandpa at work contrasted against news clippings of Richard and Linda's Florida ventures, captioned innocently as Legacy versus Luggage, What's Family Worth, with hashtags that trended locally overnight, the post going mildly viral among Midwestern groups discussing inheritance woes, drawing comments from strangers who commiserated about deadbeat kin while subtly shaming my parents' timeline of absences and sudden suits, the satisfaction rolling in like a well-timed harvest as I monitored from my kitchen table. Imagining Hargrove fielding calls from irate locals while the judge's clerk liked the post, pure coincidence or not, turning their motives into fodder for memes that poked fun at snowbird suitors without a single legal violation. A clever payback that felt empowering yet left me uneasy because Sarah was right. It echoed their own manipulations in a mirror I didn't love staring into. As the hearings wrapped with the judge denying the asset freeze, but ordering expedited discovery that included those very birth records, the atmosphere thickened with impending confrontation. Tom dropping by the farm to share a locked journal from Grandpa's safe that hinted at the affair's full scope, Richard confronting the salesman in a bar brawl that nearly cost the family the land through lawsuits, Harlan paying it off quietly to preserve peace. Another twist that solidified why he'd shielded me so fiercely, suggesting my blood might run truer to the farm than to them, the revelation deepening the conflict as I debated subpoenaing it all or letting ambiguity erode their case from within, the uncertainty making sleep fitful with dreams of gavels and ghosts. The growing revenge simmered through it all, honest in its drive for closure, but laced with that touch of light vulgarity in my private vents to Carla about how my parents were clumsier than a bull in a china shop full of alibis. Yet the emotional pull toward resolution clashed with the fear that full truth might unravel more than it mended, leaving Jack's innocent questions about the family fight to hang like unanswered prayers. On the morning of the full trial, as I adjusted my collar in the courthouse mirror and Carla reviewed last-minute notes, I stepped into the emptying hallway for a breath of air only to overhear Hargrove in a side office. His voice hushed but urgent on the phone about a game-changer witness who could prove Emily wasn't even Harlan's bloodkin, the words freezing me in place behind the half-closed door, heart slamming as I realized they'd unearthed something explosive, perhaps a sibling or a switched record that could flip the parentage bomb into their favor, the bombshell conversation trailing off with instructions to keep it under wraps until testimony, propelling me back to Carla with the news that shattered my careful composure and set the stage for whatever truth was about to explode in open court. Pushing through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom that final morning felt like stepping into the eye of a hurricane after chasing the winds for weeks. The room already humming with a low murmur of spectators from town who had trickled in like they were attending a county fair sideshow rather than a family feud over farmland, and as I took my seat beside Carla with my palms damp against the polished armrest, I could see Richard and Linda across the aisle, their faces drawn tight with that mix of anticipation and anxiety that comes from betting the house on a hand you suspect might be bluffing, Hargrove shuffling papers at their table while the bailiff called the room to order, the Judge Harlan, still a coincidence that twisted my thoughts every time, settling into his elevated chair with a gavel tap that silenced the whispers and set my nerves thrumming like a bowstring drawn too long. The proceedings unfolded methodically at first, Hargrove calling his witnesses to weave a tale of Grandpa's supposed decline, starting with a neighbor who hedged under cross about Harlan's forgetfulness, but admitted he'd beaten him at checkers right up to the end, then moving to an expert on elder influence who droned about vulnerability and isolation, only for Carla to dismantle it with timelines of my parents' own long absence that made their sudden guardianship claims look as flimsy as wet cardboard, and throughout it all, the subtle clues I'd dropped like breadcrumbs, the affair whispers. From Mrs. Delaney, the financial leaks that had the jury pool nodding knowingly built a quiet undercurrent that had the judge jotting notes more frequently than usual, his glances toward their side sharpening as if he were already piecing together the greed behind the grievances. When it was our turn, Tom Riley took the stand with his ledger and loyalty, recounting how Grandpa had confided the will's rationale over late-night coffees, emphasizing that blood meant less than backbone in a legacy. Built on sweat, his testimony laced with anecdotes of me mending equipment they'd never touched, which drew a few chuckles from the back row when he quipped that some folks treat family farms like piggy banks, but forget the pigs do the work. The humor cutting through the tension like a well-timed plow turning soil, yet it amplified my internal dilemma as I watched Linda dab at her eyes, wondering if my revenges, the anonymous posts, the circulated petitions, had pushed her to genuine remorse or just performative tears, that disagreeable edge making me question whether the audience would cheer my clever barbs or cringe at how they echoed the manipulations I'd fought against, especially with Jack waiting outside with Sarah, his innocent faith in my winning the farm fight weighing heavier than any gavel. The twist that Hargrove had teased in that overheard phone call detonated midway through the afternoon when he called his game-changer witness, a distant cousin from Linda's side named Evelyn, who shuffled to the stand with a manila envelope trembling in her hands, claiming to have letters proving Grandpa had kidnapped me as a child to cover up the affair's fallout, and that I wasn't even Richard's daughter, but the product of that traveling salesman's indiscretion, her voice quavering as she read snippets about hushed adoptions and family shame that tied directly to the blank father line on my photocopy, the courtroom gasping softly while my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on the stairs, because this wasn't just dirt, it was dynamite, suggesting Harlan had rewritten the will not out of favoritism, but fierce protection for a granddaughter tied to him by choice rather than chromosomes, and as Carla objected on chain of custody grounds, the judge leaned forward with that probing stare, questioning Evelyn's motives since she'd benefited from Grandpa's quiet payoffs years back, the cross-examination unraveling her credibility when Tom confirmed the letters were forgeries cobbled from old gossip to bolster the suit. A revelation that left Hargrove red-faced and fumbling while the partial truth hung in the air, confirming the parentage ambiguity without full closure. Was I Harlan's blood through some twist, or just the legacy he'd claimed as his own, leaving me reeling with the uncertainty that this bombshell, meant to bury me, had instead exposed their desperation like a flashlight in a dark closet full of skeletons. The growing conflict peaked in that moment, my mind flashing to the revenges I'd savored, the witty leaks that now seemed petty in the face of such raw unraveling, and even as the judge adjourned for a recess, I caught Richard's glare across the room. His whisper to Linda carrying just enough for me to hear, "We should have settled. A crack in there." Armor that fueled the impending payback, but also stirred a reluctant pity, making viewers perhaps disagree with my unyielding stance as too cold for blood that might not even bind us. Resuming after the break, Carla unveiled the ultimate clever stipulation from Grandpa's will like a hidden ace in a high-stakes poker game. A clause she'd held back until the perfect beat that tied the entire estate into an irrevocable trust for the farm's continuation and Jack's education, conditioned on no successful contests from direct heirs unless fraud was proven beyond doubt, which their side's crumbling witness had only weakened further, the document's language ironclad and witnessed by the same farmers who'd vouched for Harlan's mind, effectively locking them out while allowing me stewardship without the taint of outright ownership that could be chipped away. The judge reviewing it page by page with a growing frown that mirrored the color draining from Richard and Linda's faces as realization dawned that Grandpa had anticipated their greed and built a moat around his intentions wider than any courtroom argument. In the hushed fallout, he gathered the room's attention with a slow lean into the microphone, his eyes flicking from me steady now, chin up like Grandpa taught to them, then back, before drawling in that deliberate drawl that cut through the tension like a scythe through wheat. "Wait, you're suing her." The words hanging for a beat that stretched eternal, their complexions paling to the shade of overripe corn as the implications sank in, the judge continuing with a measured dissection of their claims as opportunistic after decades of disinterest, dismissing the suit outright with orders for them to cover costs and a stern warning about perjury in witness coaching, the gavel's final crack echoing like thunder after a long drought. Sealing my victory in a rush of murmurs and backslaps from Tom and the gallery, while Carla squeezed my shoulder with a grin that said we'd turn their storm into our sunshine. Walking out into the crisp afternoon light with the farm papers clutched like a hard-won trophy, the weight lifted, but left an odd hollowness, because winning everything, the land that smelled of earth and effort, the business that employed folks who'd become family, the savings that promised Jack a future unshadowed by debt, tasted bittersweet against the ambiguities that lingered, the parentage question unanswered like a half-read letter tucked away, making me ponder if Grandpa's secrets had spared me pain or just allayed it. And as Richard and Linda slunk past without a word, their rental car kicking up gravel in hasty retreat. I felt the revenge's satisfaction fade into reflection on whether cutting ties forever healed the old wounds or merely cauterized them, leaving scars that Jack might one day trace with questions I wasn't ready to voice. Sarah waited with him by the courthouse steps, his small hand waving a drawing of the farm that he'd made during the wait, and hugging him close while the sun warmed my back. I wondered if this path of retribution had made me stronger, or just more like the neglect I'd escaped, the thought-provoking haze settling as we drove home with the radio humming a tune about roads not taken. The unanswered truths whispering that family legacies aren't always about blood or bucks, but the choices we root in despite the storms.